Welcome back to Pokemon Episode Summaries. Today, I'll be doing episode 111, The Wacky Watcher. Ash and the gang were on their way to the Orange League following Ash's win with his final gym badge. He admired all 4 of his gym badges as Tracy dipped his hand in the water to collect a water sample, stating he was going to use it for some research. Pikachu then spots something in the water and alerts Ash and the gang of its existence, when suddenly it's revealed to be a submarine driven by an old man. The old man comes out of the submarine and informs Ash and the gang that they were about to see something very, very special that would be one of the most astounding scenes they've ever seen on the seas. As if on cue, the man pulls out his binoculars and watches as a whole bunch of Magikarp surface and pass by. The man gets extremely excited, stating that it was a whole school and that he knew where they were going, and proceeds to follow the school of Magikarp in his submarine. As for Tracy, he was fascinated by the blue bands that were on some of the Magikarp, wondering why they were there. Tracy then looks up ahead and sees the Magikarp float away, seeing an island in the distance, and using his map to confirm that this island was Rind Island, and the Magikarp were likely heading there, so they decide to follow the old man and the Magikarp. When Ash and the gang arrive on Rind Island, Ash instantly recalls his Lapras, and they instantly see the Magikarp swimming upstream. They had arrived on the island, and were now in its rivers. They sat down to watch the Magikarp when they remembered that they weren't alone. The old man was on the island as well, and he was carrying a whole bunch of supplies, stating that he needed them for research, and requesting that Ash and the gang carry them for him. Okay, he didn't really request, he more forced them to carry them, even Pikachu. Ash and the gang questioned why they should be helping a random old man carry his supplies around, and asking what he was even trying to research anyway, leading the old man to reveal that his name was Quincy T. Quackenpoker, and that he was a Pokemon watcher like Tracy, who was dedicated to the study of Magikarp. That was basically all he fucking cared about, was Magikarp. After Quackenpoker revealed himself, Tracy instantly recognized him as being a famous Pokemon watcher, and therefore wanted to try and impress him. So, he went up to the Magikarp and tried to draw a sketch of them so that he could point something out to Quackenpoker, hoping to find a secret regarding them. But all that happens is when he goes down to the Magikarp, they splash him, and he falls down. The splash also causes his pen to get wet when he tried to draw the Magikarp, leading Quackenpoker to say that he should have brought a waterproof pen instead. So really, this just backfired in his face, and he didn't end up impressing Quackenpoker. Damn. Tracy then gets his ass up and continues walking with Quackenpoker, Ash, and Misty. When Ash and Misty get tired from doing all the heavy lifting and walking, and request that they take a break to stop, Quackenpoker happily obliges, as they had now reached a point in the stream where the Magikarp were kind of slowing down, so it was a good time for him to analyze them. The Quackenpoker then pulls out a camera with a tripod so it could analyze information on the number and physical condition of the Magikarp in the water. Tracy questions why there were bands on the Magikarp like he had spotted earlier, with Quackenpoker revealing that he had placed those bands on the Magikarp to help him with his research as well. He further explains that this here island, Rind Island, was the Magikarp's birthplace, and they all left the island eventually to go and mature, but once a year, including today, they would return to their island in order to breed and evolve. However, he added that not all the Magikarp evolved when they returned, and sometimes it would take them multiple returns across multiple years to evolve. That's why he placed different colored bands on all the Magikarp, since the bands dictated how long ago the Magikarp had initially left the island, and how many years it had been since then, and so like how many years it had been and they still hadn't evolved by that point. Magikarp that had red bands left 1 year ago, blue ones left 2 years ago, and yellow ones left 3 years ago. Meaning that the yellow banded Magikarps had returned to the island 3 times and yet still not evolved. That was why he was studying the potential differences in the Magikarp, to see why some of them evolved after only 1 year, and for others it took them way longer. Tracy stated how interesting he found all this due to also being a Pokemon watcher, and when Quackenpoker found out that Tracy was also a Pokemon watcher, he got excited and requested to look at Tracy's sketchbook to see what he had researched. When he sees Tracy's sketchbook, he immediately tells him that Tracy was a fine Pokemon watcher in the making, and that he had a great future ahead of him. Tracy was ecstatic at this due to being recognized by such a famous Pokemon watcher. Let's go, Tracy development. Meanwhile, Team Rocket was also on Rind Island, spying on Ash and the gang, and James and Meowth were kind of depressed, as they realized that the Magikarp were lame as fuck, so they probably shouldn't steal them, deciding to just go with boring old Pikachu instead. However, Jessie then reminded them that the Magikarp may be boring, but they evolve into Gyarados, the fucking crazy monsters. Jessie clarifies that if they just caught enough Magikarp and trained them up to evolve them, then they would have an entire army of Gyarados and could use it to rule the world. However, James isn't convinced by this whole Gyarados plan, as he has fucking PTSD from the Gyarados aboard the St. Anne, and all the other Gyarados encounters they've had, and he's like, no fucking way, I don't want to mess with them. But Jessie was really, really insistent on this idea, and started to brag about how she came up with it. James, not wanting to deal with this bragging anymore, decided to go along with the plan, and proceeded to run off. But Jessie took a while to follow, because she was so in awe of herself that she came up with this idea. She was just like frozen in place. Meanwhile, back with Ash and the gang, the Magikarp had resumed moving again, and Ash and the gang watched in amazement as the Magikarp then climbed up a waterfall. Ash is confused as to why the Magikarp are trying to swim up a waterfall, instead of trying to find a way around it, and Tracy states his assumption that it was probably because the Magikarp wanted to prove that they could get up the waterfall, to prove that they were strong enough to become Gyarados, because if they weren't strong enough to climb a waterfall, then they clearly weren't ready to evolve. Mr. Quackenpoker adds that this was likely the reason why so many Magikarp took longer to complete their evolution, because if they weren't strong enough to get up the waterfall, then they would return back away from the island, and then they would try again next year, and they would just keep trying until they were successful. Sure enough, a whole bunch of the Magikarp were failing to make it up the waterfall, and proceeded to begin to return back to where they came from, so this confirmed Quackenpoker's theory. further revealing that only 50% of the Magikarp had made it successfully up the waterfall. Also at the top of the falls was Team Rocket, who were armed with nets, ready to capture any incoming Magikarp as they reached the top. James questioned why they were using nets instead of Pokeballs, with Jesse revealing that Team Rocket was broke as fuck, so they could only afford nets. Nets were clearly all that was needed though, as James managed to capture a Magikarp. However, it was so slippery that it slipped out of the net. The Magikarp returns to the water, leading Jesse and James and Meowth to follow it in, and they manage to recapture it, but before they can get out of the water, they're thrown down by a waterfall. Ash hears Team Rocket's screams of desperation as they were being dragged down, and informs the others that someone could be in trouble, but Quack and Poker shrugs this off, being more interested in the fact that the Magikarp were likely about to evolve, and they might miss it if they didn't focus. He then suggested that they get a better view, so Ash and the gang follow him up a hill that led to the same destination that the top of the waterfall did, in excitement that they could potentially see a Gyarados soon. They sit by the lake, awaiting the evolution, as they decide to have some lunch. As they eat, Mr. Quack and Poker comments on Ash and Pikachu's relationship, noticing how they had such a strong bond, and he also comments on how Togepi appeared to like being patted on its front head spike, much to Misty's delight as she proceeded to do so. Tracy was amazed with Mr. Quack and Poker's knowledge of other Pokemon, fully expecting him to just be a giant Magikarp geek and nothing else, and also amazed at the fact that he was able to see Ash and Pikachu's bond despite just meeting them. Mr. Quack and Poker responds by stating that was what a Pokemon watcher was best at, knowing things from just looking at them a little bit. Adding that, although Magikarp was his absolute obsession, he did acknowledge that other Pokemon were great too, and that's why he also studied them occasionally. Quack and Poker then revealed his reasoning for his infatuation with Magikarp, being that when he woke up one morning when he was a child, a Magikarp just suddenly was in his pajamas out of nowhere, and he thought that was so interesting that he dedicated his life to figuring out the secrets behind Magikarp. What the fuck, dude? What was a Magikarp doing in your pants? Even Quack and Poker admitted he didn't know. Anyways, by nighttime, the Magikarp had still not evolved, so Ash and Misty decided to go to sleep, but Mr. Quack and Poker and Tracy stayed up to talk about Magikarp. Tracy shows Mr. Quack and Poker a sketch to illustrate his theory on how the reason why Magikarp always seemed to jump out of the water was because they wanted to see the sun, since the sun may have been what guided them to find their way to this island. Quack and Poker rebuts this by revealing through his many years of studying the Magikarp that he has seen plenty that couldn't jump whatsoever, so there had to have been another way for them to get to the island other than the sun. Suddenly, the Magikarp began to jump super high out of the water to the point of reaching the moon, and this led Mr. Quack and Poker to get excited, as usually when the Magikarp did this on other years, it meant that they were getting very close to evolution. Being very excited to do so, Ash and Misty are woken up by how loud the Magikarp were being when they splashed back into the water, and come out of the tent they had set up to immediately see Team Rocket, who had since surfaced in their Magikarp sub. This led Mr. Quack and Poker to realize that the Magikarp weren't just jumping frantically because they were about to evolve, they were jumping in panic, as they noticed the sub, and they noticed its grabbing hands that were now attached to it, and did their best to round up all of the Magikarp. Mr. Quack and Poker blames himself for not realizing that the waters were growing restless, insinuating that there must have been something below the water, being Team Rocket's Magikarp sub. Team Rocket were definitely happy that he made that oversight though, as now they had a whole bunch of Magikarp filling their submarine. This actually worked against them though, as the Magikarp's weight together was so heavy that their sub began to sink, much to their surprise. They instantly tried to act on this by throwing out some of the Magikarp back into the water, and decided that it was probably best that they did focus on Pikachu after all, as Pikachu wouldn't weigh down the goddamn sub. So they proceed to come out of their sub and begin their motto, revealing themselves, and Ash and the gang are extremely bored by their motto as usual, to the point where Mr. Quack and Poker cuts it off and demands that Team Rocket release the Magikarp from their sub. Team Rocket, having a plan to steal Pikachu, actually obliged to this as they proceed to throw out all of the Magikarp, stopping their sub from sinking and forcing Ash and the gang to catch all the Magikarp, as otherwise the Magikarp would land all over them and get injured most likely, and they wanted to stop that from happening. This obviously worked in Team Rocket's favor, as since Ash and the gang were so preoccupied with catching the Magikarp, Meowth was able to press a button that deployed a hand from the Magikarp sub to grab Pikachu and trap him in a glass cage. It wasn't an electric-proof cage this time though, so Ash ordered Pikachu to use Thunderbolt so he could simply escape, but Mr. Quack and Poker stopped him, saying that if Ash used Thunderbolt, then he could potentially injure the Magikarp. This leads Ash to send out his Bulbasaur by kicking open its Pokeball due to his hands being preoccupied, and he has Bulbasaur use Vine Whip in an attempt to grab Pikachu's cage from James. Bulbasaur jumps up to the Magikarp sub, but he falls off with only being able to knock James out and not grab Pikachu's cage. Ash sends Bulbasaur back to his Pokeball, not wanting it to fall, and James shortly after this wakes up from Bulbasaur's slap, only to find a Magikarp stuck on his head. It must have slipped out of Jessie's hand when she was trying to throw it or something, I don't fucking know. All I know is Team Rocket has terrible luck with Magikarp. Jessie and Meowth try their best to pull Magikarp off, almost ripping off Magikarp's head in the process, and when Mr. Quack and Poker sees this, he immediately rushes into the water and climbs up to the top of Team Rocket's sub, and strokes the Magikarp's fin to calm it down so it releases James, without Jessie having to rip its head off. Team Rocket celebrates at James's freedom, causing them to get distracted, and James to drop Pikachu's cage, so Ash is able to pick it up and free Pikachu from the cage. Yay! Just then, the Magikarp that Mr. Quack and Poker got off of James's head begins to evolve in Mr. Quack and Poker's arms. Noticing that other Magikarp were beginning to evolve as well, and swimming into the middle of the lake, Mr. Quack and Poker throws the Magikarp back into the lake as it goes to meet up with the rest of them, and they all evolve in a huge white light into Gyarados, creating a huge typhoon in the process that traps Team Rocket in their sub and sends them blasting off. The Gyarados, having completed their evolution, along with several Magikarp who weren't ready yet, then begin their trek back to the random-ass ocean away from the island. Before the Gyarados and Magikarp fully go away though, Tracy and Dr. Quack and Poker observe them, to get this year's data on how many of the Magikarp had evolved and failed to evolve respectively. They find out that 70% of the Magikarp had evolved, which was the highest percentage that Dr. Quackenpoker had seen in all of his years of doing this. By morning, the Gyarados had all swam off along with the other Magikarp, and Dr. Quackenpoker thanks Tracy for all the help he did with his research and all the theories that he provided. Tracy thanks him in return for all that he had taught him about being a Pokemon watcher. Ash remarks how Tracy had improved vastly in his goal of becoming a great Pokemon watcher, and told Pikachu that if they won in the upcoming Orange League, then it would further Ash's goal as well, which was to be a Pokemon Master. Oh yeah. Ash and the gang then say goodbye to Dr. Quackenpoker as the episode ends with one last scene from Team Rocket. It turns out they had blasted off to the middle of the sea and were now coincidentally cornered by all the Gyarados that had evolved. Jessie, still appreciating the Gyarados and believing that they could rule the world with them, suggested that the Gyarados may be nicer than they seem, and they could try and convince them to join their side. However, James wasn't so sure, as the Gyarados proceeded to circle around them, and they looked pretty hungry.